I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. Recently, Chinese search engine Baidu had to face a public crisis of trust after being accused of contributing to the death of a young man following the case of a 21-year-old college student named Wei Zexi, who died of cancer after he allegedly received questionable treatment from a hospital which is listed high on Baidu's search results. The tragedy has stirred much discussion in China. Who should be held responsible for the tragedy of the young student? What lessons can we learn from this Baidu crisis? And how should China deepen its healthcare reforms? To discuss all these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Victor Gao, a current affairs commentator, and Edward Lehman, managing director of Lehman, Lee & Shi. Before getting started, let's take a look at this.
A heartbreaking farewell to a young man.
在我读大二的时候，发现自己身患恶性肿瘤。
Wei Zexi, a 21-year college student, died from a form of rare cancer on April the 12th after 2 years of costly treatment. His death sparked anger on the internet because of an article he published accusing Baidu of being an evil company that misled his treatment. Wei Zexi was diagnosed from a terminal soft tissue disease. After he was informed by a lot of hospitals in Beijing and Shanghai that he wouldn't survive, Wei took to Baidu, China's largest search engine, to search for a cure. And he found something that he believed would change his life. Baidu results led him to visit a department under the second hospital of Beijing Armed Police Corps, which offered an experimental treatment. Wei was told by doctors at this hospital that he had an 80 to 90% chance of survival. They guaranteed him 20 years of life if he took the treatment. He took them on their word, but died anyway. In a self-made video before his death, the young man expressed his strong willingness to live, saying he believed that the world is too good to give up. He posted an article on Zhihu.com, a Chinese question and answer forum, in February before he died, questioning Baidu for taking money to rank searching results. Wei said that his family has spent more than 200,000 yuan, or $30,000, on a therapy that did not cure him.
经过这1年多的治疗，我经历了常人所无法想象的巨大痛苦。我的家庭也不堪重负，但我不想死。我还有梦想，我想看看这个广大的世界，我想经历自己的一个完整的人生，成就自己的事业。
Gentlemen, what do you think of the current Baidu bashing campaign? Do you think Baidu should be held responsible for the tragedy?
You know, it's a terrible situation, a terrible tragedy with what happened to Mr. Wei, but I am not convinced that Baidu is certainly the cause and effect with regards to this, and I think it's a bit of an exaggeration. I understand the anger that Mr. Wei and his family have felt because of the situation. But I'm not convinced it was Baidu's fault solely and that they're legally held responsible. Even if this was in the United States, it would be questionable if that was indeed the case. And I also want to add that I actually had this exact same form of cancer.
I'm surprised to hear that.
Yes, I know.
And you survived
sarcoma. Yeah, exactly. 10 years ago, and it had to treat it
by not turning to the help from Baidu.
No, didn't do that. But the point I'm trying to make is that I went on the internet and checked hundreds of sources from around the world. I mean, it wasn't just in Putian, Fujian. I mean, so it wasn't just here in Beijing, and came up with the plan here. So,
do you think the online outcry from the general public is reasonable?
Well, first of all, allow me once again to express condolences to the family and friends of Mr. Wei, who unfortunately passed away. Secondly, I think this whole question about whether Baidu is liable or not for whatever portion of the liability contributing to Mr. Wei's death very much depends on, first of all, whether there is a fraud being practiced by the doctors involved or the clinic involved or the hospital involved in this particular case, and whether Baidu actually has knowledge or constructive knowledge about such fraudulent practice, if there is such fraud in the medical practice, as well as the knowledge or constructive knowledge of Baidu, then I would say Baidu may actually have some liability. And the evidence is now being made available seem to indicate that Baidu actually ranks these hospital service providers, not by the quality or the opinion polls, for example, done objectively, but by how much these clinics pay Baidu. So in a sense, I think one thing is whether the ranking itself is an objective ranking or it's a kind of advertisement, and whether the consumers, the netizens who come across this information would believe that they are objective ranking based on very verifiable information, or whether these are advertisements, and if they are advertisements, whether these are very misleading or in some cases fraudulent advertisements.
What legal challenges are facing Baidu at this moment?
Well, I mean, I think that they're open to a host of potential legal liabilities. There's no question about that. But remember, anyone can sue anyone for anything just about, or any company. I mean, that can happen in the United States. Less so here in China because it's difficult to file these suits. But I think that the challenge would be that they're an American company, and this goes back to what Victor Gao said, which is they're an American company, a NASDAQ company, so contrary to what everyone thinks, it's in Chinese language, Chinese search engine, located in China. But they're actually a NASDAQ traded company. They're one of the companies that's actually the underpinning of NASDAQ as far as rating what's going on with the exchange. So they would be open to some kind of legal action, probably in the United States where they're registered, and it could be a class action. There could be other people similarly situated. Are they liable? I mean, the answer is not for me to say. It's for the trier of fact, based on the actual factual situation and scenario, like was earlier pointed out. If there was fraud, if there was deception, if this was systematic. But Baidu is kind of stuck with a prisoner's dilemma, and that is, do they become experts in medical care? And do they set standards? Is that what they're supposed to do? Are they a public utility? And the answer is probably not. It should probably be done by the State Food and Drug Administration or regulatory bodies. It might be done even by overseas organizations because this is a publicly traded company.
You seem to take side with Baidu in that the government should assume some responsibilities for not being able to tighten its grip on, for example, the oversight on food and drug practices and how they are delivered to the market. What do you think of the defense by Baidu that the government should at least share the responsibility to some degree?
Well, first of all, I think there will be many parties which eventually may be held responsible for the unfortunate passing away of Mr. Wei. Secondly, I think Baidu need to really pay top-level attention to this unfolding crisis, because this crisis may actually make whatever unexpected turn in China as well as in the international market. I don't think, it is time for Baidu to be complacent or to really dig in, believing that they have the totality of the truth. And it really depends on how the whole nature of the case is being described, and the facts, will be described in court, for example, as well as in China's case, how the regulators eventually will come up to their conclusion. And I think Baidu need to go an extra mile forward in, for example, meeting with the family members of Mr. Wei, try to come up with, decent and
we understand the human
arrangement.
concerns that Baidu should share at this moment. How about the previous cases? I mean, the track record of Baidu. For example, back in the year 2008, Baidu was facing very serious crisis from a devastating television show and expose of its, for example, malpractice of paid listing. Because up to 30% of the revenue of Baidu comes from private hospitals. And Baidu was criticized by a television show. And earlier this year, in January, Baidu was accused for selling the moderation rights to a private hospital company, the forums related to blood disease. In neither case, it seemed that management of Baidu had drawn sufficient experiences and devastating lessons so that it could avoid the current scathing criticism and crusade against Baidu, the biggest search engine in China.
Right. I mean, in my opinion, you've got 46,000 employees with Baidu. It's not just Robin Li. It's not him and the co-founder. I mean, this is a huge organization. What needs to happen is a firm hand with regards to the regulator to step in and to say this is what should be done or this should not be done. For example, if it's going to be paid advertising, even if you're talking about a bulletin board that was actually selling blood products, if I remember correctly, this is the incident you talked about. The issue there is if it's labeled, this is run by XYZ, a private care hospital, and it's strictly an advertisement, then the consumer should know. But if there's no delineation, that may be problematic. If there's no rule that says there has to be a delineation, and there used to not be in the United States until the Better Business Bureau came along, and then they self-regulated and did this. So part of it is the regulator itself, and we've got a new industry here. So I mean, I understand the concern. I do think to try to turn the ship around is a difficult matter. It's not just, it's an algorithm. If the algorithm is saying it's paid, then it's paid. AdSense exists for Yahoo, I believe, and AdWords for Google.
So, Victor, people have been talking about yet another controversial issue, whether much more should have been done by the Chinese authorities to level the playing field, for example, by introducing Google back to the Chinese market. With the tough competition in the big Chinese market, allegedly, Baidu should have been more cautious, should have been more watchful with regard to how it should behave properly in rendering good service. So what do you think of such allegation that Google might be a good competitor and the malpractices could be minimized as a result?
Well, first of all, if you allow me, I would say the Chinese government or the Chinese internet users never asked Google to leave the Chinese market. To leave China and to withdraw into Hong Kong is a decision made by Google itself. Of course, the Chinese government raised several requests about self-censorship, etc., that Google at that time found impossible to accept, and they made that corporate decision to go to Hong Kong. I would say eventually, sooner or later, the Google services will be allowed back into mainland China if Google management would agree to a compromise arrangement with the Chinese regulators. And this is very specific to the Chinese market, and I think Google needs to come up with that courage or wisdom to make that decision. Secondly, I think if we only have Baidu as the dominant search engine in China, then Baidu may become complacent. Baidu may just pick the easy cherries rather than really go an uphill struggle to always be on the competitive edge. Therefore, I think eventually Google coming back or any other major search engine coming back or rise up again in China to compete with Baidu will be a better proposition for the Chinese internet users.
There are a few other search engines. For example, the Qihoo 360, but it's way too lightweight to be a serious match for the influence of Baidu in terms of the market shares. However, I believe a lot must have been going on when Baidu was considering a retreat from the Chinese market. I'm not talking about why, as Victor had said earlier, Baidu beat a retreat from the Chinese market. We are talking about the principle for which Google has been known for a long while: don't be evil.
Right.
I mean, this time around, Baidu comes under fire from the general public for the malpractice. You won't necessarily call it evil, but it's something very controversial. And therefore, this event reminds the Chinese consumers that a tough rival and competitor might be necessary to reduce the monopoly, quote unquote, by Baidu. What do you think of this necessity?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I'm a free market person, and I think China, that the direction has been for free markets and open markets and having trade agreements and having competition. And I think competition is healthy, and I think that having Google here in some way, shape, or form, and that, like you said, the other competitors haven't done well, it may be because based on their algorithms. So the algorithms of the fellows who started Google, have been groundbreaking, and Robin Lee himself actually worked at Dow Jones, and so I think that there is some value to it. But again, Bing is here, Yahoo is here, like you said, the 360 here. That there is some, but it's not launched a serious competition. But I think competition will make the place better. I think also having clear guidelines. The guidelines for advertising laws in the medical area, by the way, there's a separate body of law for that. And it was really set up for print media, and it was set up for television media, but not the new media.
In fact, the role of Google as a major search engine in the United States has not only been weakened deliberately by the American regulators and the watchdog, but also by current litigation across the Atlantic Ocean. In Europe, the European Commission has accused Google of manipulating its dominance in the use of operating system like Android system. Yeah. Now, you are watching Dialogue with Edward Lehman and Victor Gao. We are discussing the current impact of Baidu's public crisis with regard to the a tragic death of Wei Zexi, a 21-year-old university student who died of a rare cancer. Welcome back, gentlemen. It won't come as a surprise for enterprises and companies to pursue or trade moral standards for maximum profit. Google, for example, was heavily fined $500 million by the US government for over advertising it allowed from fraudulent pharmacies, and now it needs to use a verification program created by the National Association of Boards of Pharmacy, which is used to weed out rogue online drug sellers and connects to the data supplied by the US Food and Drug Administration. Now, if this is a lesson that Google has learned the hardest way, don't you think this is a kind of blessing for Baidu, which is certainly recovering from the ongoing aftershocks due to the tragic death of Wei Zexi?
Yeah, I mean, it is. Just to point out to the listeners and the viewers here that, the FDA in the United States and certainly the pharmaceutical industry is a very protected industry, and this whole idea of Obamacare and everything else is all what they're fighting about. So I'm not sure that's the best test for China, but I mean, I do think that they did take an extra step, and I think that there was a lot of protectionism, because in Canada you can buy the same pharmaceutical products just across the border for a lot lower price, or in another jurisdiction. So that's not always the best thing. This added regulation, but I think there needs to be tight regulation. I'm not sure that that's a good example. $500 million, not much money for our friends.
Not much money for Google, by the way, but it is a big lesson.
It is,
at least for its Chinese counterpart here.
Sure.
Now, Victor, in fact, the profit-driven private capital is taking up an increasing share of China's medical market, because the Chinese authorities have been urged for a long while to provide quality public services and public goods. Medical care is, of course, one of the public goods. So, what do you think of yet another form of competition between the private sector and the public sector in rendering quality medical service to the general consumers here?
Well, first of all, I would say the medical sector in China itself is one of the very few sectors in China which have not been completely reformed. And this is unfortunate. Of course, the government has its own reason of slowing down the major reform in the medical sector. Right now, there is a lack of capital investment in the medical sector, and safety and security of the medical services and products are all not in a satisfactory mood. Secondly, I would say the government still very much prohibits private investment into hospitals. Those private hospitals or clinics which are doing good businesses are really an exception in China rather than rule in the market. Thirdly, I would say one factor contributing to this crisis involving the unfortunate death of Wei Zexi is exactly private capital or private service providers try to blend into either public hospitals or, in this particular case, a hospital controlled by the armed police forces, holding themselves out as if they are the public service provider, they are the military medical provider, so that people or the patients would actually have higher level of trust in the services that these people will provide. This actually partially is related to the lack of attention by the government regulators. They need to come up with scrutinies and screening processes to prevent this kind of false information or false impression created to the patients being presented to the society at large. And I think the government need to learn a very, very big lesson from this tragic death of Mr. Wei and come up with a much better, much more robust way of regulating hospitals, either public hospitals or private practices, for example, and also prohibit these false or even fraudulent practices as most likely has been committed in the unfortunate death of Mr. Wei.
Some departments have been outsourced from reputable military hospitals, such as the Armed Police Hospital. Now, Baidu argues vehemently that it has no doubts for the credibility of such a military hospital. Therefore, that's a very strong argument for them to launch a counteroffensive. Having said that, some scholars argue that the less they have intervention from the government, the better for the market to introduce its own initiative. Now, in this case of the relationship between Baidu and the Chinese watchdog, the government's watchdog, do you think this is a wake-up call? This is a game changer for both the private capital, the private hospital, and the Chinese watchdog to give a second thought to the impact, and what should be done to further reform the medical industry here?
Well, we got several hours it would take at least to get started on the topic. But I don't disagree with anything that's been said so far. I think, however, what's happened is that they've limited the number of licenses, they've limited the number of foreign invested enterprises, or eliminated them, or made people get in it in a very creative way into the hospital industry. What I think, if it were me, I would wave the magic wand, make there be more licenses, more approvals, more transparent procedures, because this particular situation appears to be something that it didn't work, that the private hospital couldn't be opened by these people. They used the license of the military hospital, and they were in fact acting on behalf of the military hospital with their license. Now, if it was open, perhaps, where they could have private hospitals and they could pass some level of scrutiny, then you wouldn't have to resort to these kind of things, and then that would be a knock-on effect for Baidu, because Baidu would say, hey, the regulator's taking a look at this, and this is something that they're looking at. We shouldn't have to do it. When you put the standard on Baidu, the problem is that they're not in the medical business or every kind of business, then we're creating a higher barrier for them to be able to function. And like it was said earlier, a corporation is selfish. They need to make profits. They need to go forward in a thoughtful way, of course. But I'm just saying, if there's no regulation there, then it's the problem of the regulator.
Let's look at the future of Baidu. Baidu reported a 24% jump in revenue in the first quarter of 2016 on the strength of China's internet growth because of the sizable population of internet users. But the Nasdaq-listed company's shares dropped 10% in the first 2 days of the week after Chinese regulators launched their joint investigation. This isn't the first time, however, that Baidu stock has taken a hit based on the quality of its medical advertisers. As I said earlier, it was late 2008 when a television show had a scathing expose calling out Baidu for taking ads from unlicensed pharmaceuticals providers. The implications were a lot hairier at that time, and Baidu stock plunged 25% in a single day, and that makes this week's 10% drop tame by comparison. What do you think of the chance for Baidu to survive the current crisis? Will it go bankrupt as a result? Or do you think, whatever the consequences, the Chinese government has the responsibility to protect the survival, the existence of Baidu for at least the single issue and purpose of protecting the national security? Because we've been talking smart about the cyber sovereignty in the national security in its relationship with that.
Yeah, no, I mean, no. Do I think Baidu will go bankrupt from this? No, not at all. Is it a bit of a bump? Anyone who's a long-term investor would not look at this as a negative thing. They have the majority of the market. You can talk about all kinds of numbers. That's not going away. There doesn't appear to be a rival on the forefront. Will they face some sort of litigation, some sort of regulation? Yes, but I mean, I think this is a good thing, not a bad thing. It's a tragedy with what happened, but let's try to learn from it and go forward. I think the government will. I think that the company itself will. I think you just have to label that this is an advertisement and that they should participate and do their own research to make an assumption. And certainly people who are at university or graduate from university are more intelligent, or should be, to be able to make these assessments, I would imagine. Now again, everyone's grieving and it's a tough situation, but I do believe that Baidu will come out of this bigger and better and stronger. I do believe, however, that Google should be in this market, or someone else should be in this market as well, in a more robust way, and it's only better for Baidu.
Given the alleged consequences arising from the joint probe by the government agencies to figure out what's wrong with the paid listings of Baidu, do you think this is going to be a pretty severe winter for the private capital to be injected further into the medical services in China?
No, I hope not. I think the medical sector in China needs very profound and large-scale comprehensive reform, and it should be done sooner rather than later. And part of the reform is to allow private capital, foreign capital to pour into this sector. It's very encouraging, for example, that in the China-Australian Free Trade Agreement, Australia is allowed to set up private-owned hospitals in China, in 6 cities and provinces. This is encouraging, and I hope more foreign capital and private capital will be allowed into making investments in hospitals, clinics, medical production, etc. A whole range of things that the foreign capital and private capital should be allowed to invest in. That's number one. Number two is that the crux of the matter in the unfortunate death of Mr. Wei is whether there is fraud being practiced on his treatment by the medical providers. And in this particular case, the doctors and the assistants who hold themselves out as real staff members of the armed police hospital, but in reality they are not. In reality, they are independent medical providers in the disguise of the armed police hospital. So I think we need to really focus on the crux of the matter and also figure out whether there are any kind of collateral liabilities by entities like Baidu, because otherwise we will really miss the reality by a big margin. And hopefully all the stakeholders involved will learn a big lesson, and China can move in the right direction and become a better place for medical practice.
Very quickly, given the huge commercial success for Robin Li, the founding chairman of Baidu, what would be the lessons for him? He is licking the wounds, of course, given the track record of Baidu in terms of, for example, the paid listing, which is very questionable, as well as the overwhelming public anger by the social media. Very quickly. Yeah,
well, the lesson for him is make sure your house is in order, and make sure that it's as bulletproof and as liability proof as you possibly can, and go from there.
Victor,
I think he needs to be humble, and he needs to be very objective, and also he needs to treat the family of Mr. Wei in a very dignified way. And this is time to show mercy, to show kindness, and to show the warmth of his heart.
It's a test of his ability to manage the crisis anyway. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.